They said the safest place on the station was anywhere but that room. The alarm lights pulsed a slow, tired red across the corridor, each flash dragging shadows along the brushed steel walls like something reluctant to leave, and the air carried that faint metallic chill that clung to deep space stations running on backup power, humming low and uneven beneath Lucas Reed's boots as he stepped over a loose cable and checked the flickering panel on his wrist. Oxygen stable, pressure holding, but barely. Like the whole structure was holding its breath. He wasn't supposed to be here, not this sector, not this close to quarantine. But systems didn't care about fear. Systems failed where they wanted. And right now the grid feeding half the station had dropped to 32%, which meant if he didn't reroute power manually, a lot of people were going to be sitting in the dark wondering why the heat had gone out in the middle of nowhere. And Lucas had never been the kind of man who left a problem unsolved just because someone else called it dangerous. The hallway narrowed as he approached the reinforced door, thick, matte black, edges lined with warning glyphs that glowed a dull amber, and beneath it, stenciled in block letters that had clearly been rushed, was a single word someone had added later with a grease marker. Monster. He slowed, not because he was afraid, at least not in the way people expected, but because the station itself seemed quieter here, like sound didn't quite want to cross the threshold, and even the distant chatter over the comms had dropped to a static whisper, as if everyone else had agreed, without saying it out loud, to stay far away. Lucas reached the panel beside the door and popped it open with a practiced twist of his tool, exposing a mess of wiring and a diagnostic port blinking weakly, the readout confirming what he already knew: main relay offline, manual reset required from inside. And for a moment, he just stood there, fingers hovering, feeling the low vibration of the station through the metal, steady but strained, like a heartbeat pushing against something too tight. He had heard the stories, everyone had, about what was sealed behind that door, about the incident, about how a routine transport had turned into something classified and then quietly buried under layers of protocol and fear, about how people stopped using names and started using words like it and containment, because it was easier that way. Lucas exhaled slowly, the sound loud in his own ears, and keyed in the override, the lock responding with a reluctant hiss as pressure equalized, the seam along the door glowing faint blue before sliding open just enough to let him through. And the moment he stepped inside, the air changed, warmer, heavier, carrying a subtle, almost electric scent that prickled at the back of his throat. The room was larger than he expected, maybe 20 feet across, lit by a single overhead strip that flickered between white and dim gold, casting long, uneven shadows across the floor where cables and monitoring units lay half-abandoned, their screens frozen on unreadable data. And at the center, beyond the scattered equipment, there was movement, not sudden, not aggressive, just a small shift, like someone adjusting their weight after sitting too long. Lucas didn't reach for anything, didn't call out, didn't step back. He just stood there for a second, taking it in, the quiet, the hum, the presence, and then, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, he walked forward a few steps and lowered himself down onto the cold metal floor, close enough to be seen, far enough not to crowd, and rested his hands loosely on his knees. He didn't know what she was yet, not really. Didn't know the details behind the warnings or the labels scrawled on the door, but he knew what it felt like to be left alone in a place everyone else avoided. And as the light flickered again, softer this time, he stayed exactly where he was, because sometimes the bravest thing a person could do wasn't to fight, or fix, or run, but simply to sit where no one else would. The silence did not break when he sat down. It only shifted, like the room itself had noticed him and was deciding what to do next. And somewhere behind him the door sealed with a soft magnetic click that sounded far louder than it should have, cutting him off from the rest of the station in a way that felt less like a barrier and more like a choice he had already made. Lucas kept his eyes forward at first, not staring, not searching, just letting the flickering light settle across the edges of the space until the shape at the center resolved into something clearer, something undeniably alive. And when he finally looked directly at her, he did not flinch, not because there was nothing to fear, but because he had decided a long time ago that fear did not get to choose his actions. She was taller than he expected even while seated, her frame folded inward as if she were trying to take up less space, skin a muted blue that caught the weak light in soft gradients, not glowing, not threatening, just present. And there was a subtle tremor running through her arms, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, like a vibration passing through her instead of from her. Cables lay disconnected around her, restraints open but not removed, as if someone had started to change their mind and then stopped halfway through. and the monitors nearby still blinked fragments of data that no longer meant anything to anyone who had already walked away. Lucas shifted slightly, the metal beneath him cold even through his work pants, and rested one hand on the floor, palm down, steady, a quiet signal more to himself than to her that he was not going anywhere. And for a few seconds nothing happened, no movement, no sound beyond the uneven hum of failing systems. But then her head turned just a fraction, slow enough that it felt deliberate, and her eyes found him. They were not what he expected, not wild, not empty, but focused in a way that carried weight, like she was measuring something he could not see. And for a moment the air between them seemed to tighten, not physically, but in a way that made his chest feel just a little heavier, like pressure building behind glass. He inhaled once, steady and controlled, and did not look away. A faint sound followed, not quite a word, not quite a breath, more like a note caught between the two, and Lucas realized it was coming from her, a low, uneven exhale that carried something close to confusion. As if his presence did not match the pattern she had come to expect, he let out a small breath of his own, slower this time, matching the rhythm without thinking, and leaned back just enough to make his posture less rigid, less like someone bracing for impact, and more like someone simply waiting. The overhead light flickered again, dimming for half a second, and in that brief shadow her outline softened, less sharp, less defined by the words someone had written on the door, and more by the way she held herself, cautious, contained, like she had learned that even stillness could be mistaken for danger. Lucas glanced briefly toward the broken relay panel on the far wall. The reason he had come in the first place. Wires exposed and sparking faintly, the entire system waiting for a reset that would take less than 30 seconds. But he did not move toward it yet, not while the space between them was still deciding what it was going to become. Instead, he reached slowly to his side pouch, movements deliberate and unhurried, and pulled out a small water flask, standard issue, scratched from years of use, and set it down on the floor between them, not sliding it forward, not offering it directly, just placing it within reach as if it had always belonged there. Her gaze shifted to it, then back to him, and the tension in the air did not spike the way he had been warned it might. It only changed, like a frequency adjusting. Searching for something stable, Lucas did not speak, because words felt unnecessary here, too heavy for a moment built on something simpler, something quieter, and as the station hummed around them, struggling to keep itself together, he realized that whatever this room had been before he walked in, it was no longer just a place people avoided. It was a space where, for the first time in a long while, someone had chosen to stay. The station did not like uncertainty, and it showed in the way the lights stuttered again, longer this time, casting the room into a dim amber haze that made every surface look softer than it really was, and Lucas could feel the systems outside struggling to compensate, rerouting power in uneven pulses that traveled through the floor beneath his hand. He knew he should move, should fix the relay while there was still time, but something in the way the air had settled between them held him there, like stepping away too soon would break whatever fragile balance had formed. The woman at the center of the room shifted again, not retreating, not advancing, just adjusting, and the small motion carried a weight that made Lucas straighten slightly without thinking, his attention returning fully to her as her gaze lingered on the flask, then moved back to his face with a kind of careful focus that felt less like suspicion and more like evaluation. He had seen that look before, not in situations like this, but in people trying to understand something that did not fit their expectations, something that refused to behave the way it was supposed to. Her fingers moved next, slow and deliberate, brushing against the metal floor as if testing it. And when they reached the flask, she paused, the faint tremor in her hand becoming more visible now that it was closer, like a current running just beneath the surface of her skin. Lucas remained still, breathing steady, giving her the space to decide, and when she finally touched it, the reaction was not what he expected. There was no sudden surge, no spike in tension, only a subtle shift in the air, as if the pressure that had been building quietly eased by a fraction. She lifted the flask slightly, turning it in her hand with a kind of unfamiliarity, studying it, rather than using it. And for a moment Lucas wondered if something as simple as water even mattered to her, or if the gesture itself was the point. A faint sound escaped her again, softer this time, closer to a question than anything else. And though he did not understand the language, he understood the tone, uncertainty wrapped in something that might have been curiosity. He tilted his head just a little, not mimicking, not mocking, just acknowledging, and answered in the simplest way he could, his voice low, even, steady enough to carry without breaking the quiet, saying, "It is yours, you can keep it." The words did not translate. He could tell that much by the way her expression did not shift. Immediately, But something in the cadence, the lack of urgency, seemed to reach her anyway, because her grip on the flask relaxed instead of tightening, and the tremor in her arm lessened just slightly. Another flicker of light passed overhead, and this time when the shadows returned, they did not feel as sharp, the edges of the room less defined by fear and more by presence. Two figures sharing the same space without forcing it into something else. Lucas glanced once more toward the relay panel, the indicator now blinking more erratically, warning him that the window to fix it was closing, and he let out a slow breath through his nose, weighing the choice in a way that felt heavier than it should have for something so routine. He shifted his weight, preparing to stand, and the moment he did, the air tightened again, not violently, not dangerously, but enough that he felt it. A subtle resistance like a change in pressure before a storm. He froze halfway through the movement, one hand still on the floor, and looked back at her, meeting her eyes as the faint tremor returned to her shoulders. He did not sit back down immediately, but he did not rise either, holding that in-between space where intention mattered more than action, and after a second that stretched longer than it should have, he eased himself back to where he had been, slow, deliberate, removing the tension from the room 1 inch at a time. The effect was immediate in its own quiet way, the air settling. Again, the hum of the station returning to its uneven baseline, and Lucas realized then that whatever she was, whatever they had called her, she was not reacting to movement alone. She was reacting to something deeper, something tied to the way people felt when they looked at her. He rested his hand flat against the metal once more, grounding himself, and allowed the silence to return, not empty, but full of something unspoken, something fragile that had not yet decided what it wanted to become. And for the first time since he had stepped into the room, he understood that fixing the station might be the easier part of his job, because this, whatever this was, required something no manual had ever taught him. The station timer somewhere deep in the system clicked over to another minute, and Lucas felt it in the way the floor vibrated beneath his palm. A subtle reminder that time was still moving even if this room had chosen to slow everything else down. The relay panel behind him gave a sharp, uneven pulse of light, brighter than before, followed by a faint crackle that echoed softly against the curved walls. And he knew the margin for delay was thinning, that soon the choice to wait would turn into a consequence he could not ignore. But when he glanced toward it, his body did not follow, because the shift beside him mattered more in that moment. She had adjusted her posture again, no longer folded inward as tightly, one arm resting loosely across her lap, while the other held the flask with a steadier grip, the tremor still there, but less erratic, like a signal finding its frequency instead of fighting it. Her eyes had not left him for several seconds now, and there was something different in the way she looked, not the sharp calculation from before, but something quieter, something closer to recognition, as if she had begun to map him into a category that did not exist in her previous understanding. Lucas exhaled slowly, keeping his breathing measured, and shifted his weight just enough to ease the tension in his back, without altering his distance. Careful, deliberate, aware now that even the smallest movement carried meaning here. The air responded again, not tightening, not loosening, but adjusting, like a system recalibrating around a new constant. And he realized that whatever she was sensing, it was not his actions alone, it was the intent behind them, the absence of the sharp edge most people carried when they entered this room. A faint chime sounded from his wrist panel, low and insistent, drawing his attention for just a second as the display flashed a warning in soft amber text. Grid stability at 28%, manual reset required immediately, and he felt the familiar pull of duty press against his chest, the straightforward logic of a problem that needed fixing. He looked back at her, weighing that logic against the fragile equilibrium they had built, and for the first time in a long while, the answer was not obvious. He raised his hand slightly, slow enough to give her time to react, and gestured gently toward the relay panel behind him, not pointing, not commanding, just indicating, his voice low and calm as he spoke again, explaining without expectation that he needed to fix something so the rest of the station could keep working, that he would not leave, that he would come back to this exact spot. The words were simple, but he kept the tone steady, the rhythm unbroken, offering consistency more than meaning. Her gaze followed the motion of his hand, then returned to his face, and for a brief moment the tremor in her shoulders increased, the air tightening just enough to make the hairs on his arms rise. And Lucas held still, letting the moment pass without forcing it forward. Seconds stretched, the station humming unevenly around them. And then, slowly, she shifted again, this time not away from him but slightly to the side, creating a small opening in the space between them. Not an invitation, not exactly, but not a barrier either. It was enough, Lucas nodded once, almost imperceptibly, acknowledging the gesture without making it larger than it needed to be, and began to move, careful, controlled, each step measured as he rose to his feet and turned toward the relay panel. The moment he increased the distance, he felt the change, a faint pressure building again in the air behind him. Not aggressive, not hostile, just present, like a question waiting for an answer, and he kept his movements steady, resisting the instinct to rush, because rushing would mean fear, and fear was the one thing he could not afford to bring into this room. He knelt beside the panel and opened the casing fully, exposing the damaged relay, wires glowing faintly with residual heat, the interface blinking in a pattern that bordered on failure. And as he reached in to begin the manual reset, he kept his breathing even, his mind anchored not just to the task but to the presence behind him, aware that every small shift in his focus might ripple outward. The tools in his hand felt familiar, grounding, a reminder of the simpler world outside this room where problems followed predictable rules, and as he worked, aligning connectors, resetting the circuit, he could feel the station responding in small increments, the hum stabilizing, the lights holding a fraction longer between flickers. When the final connection clicked into place, the relay emitted a soft, steady glow, and the vibration beneath his hand smoothed into a more consistent rhythm. The system beginning to recover. Lucas did not turn immediately, did not break the continuity they had built. He simply remained there for a second, hand resting on the panel, listening to the steadier hum. And then, slowly, he shifted his weight and moved back toward where he had been, lowering himself once more onto the cold metal floor, returning not because he had to, but because he had said he would, and in that simple follow-through, the room seemed to settle again, as if something fragile had just learned it could trust the pattern. The hum of the station evened out into something closer to a steady breath, no longer strained, no longer on the edge of collapse, and Lucas felt it through the floor before he consciously registered the change. A subtle easing of pressure that spread outward from the relay panel and settled into the walls, the lights above holding their glow now without stuttering, casting a cleaner white across the room that revealed details he had not fully seen before. The cables around her were not restraints in the traditional sense, not anymore, but remnants, abandoned connections that once tried to measure, contain, or perhaps understand, now lying slack as if the system itself had given up before finding an answer. Lucas lowered himself back into place across from her. Same distance, same posture, careful to mirror the moment he had left behind. And when he did, the air responded with a quiet familiarity, not tightening, not shifting sharply, but recognizing, like a pattern repeating, exactly as it had before. She watched him closely, and this time there was no hesitation in her gaze, no searching confusion, only a steady awareness that followed his movement from start to finish, tracking not just where he went, but how he returned. And when he settled, the faint tremor in her hands eased again, smaller now, less like instability and more like residual energy that had not yet found a place to rest. The flask still sat near her, tilted slightly where she had placed it down, and after a few seconds she reached for it again, lifting it with more certainty this time, turning it once in her hand before bringing it closer, not drinking immediately, just holding it near as if testing something beyond its purpose. Lucas rested his elbows loosely against his knees, shoulders relaxed, eyes soft but attentive, and allowed the silence to stretch, not empty, not awkward, but full of something quietly building. A faint vibration passed through the air then, so subtle it might have gone unnoticed if he had not been paying attention, a low frequency that seemed to ripple outward from her rather than toward him, brushing against his skin like a change in atmospheric pressure, and for a brief moment he felt something that was not his own, not fear, not exactly, but an echo of tension that did not belong to him, passing through and then fading just as quickly. He blinked once, steadying himself, and realized that whatever connection existed here, it was not one way, it was not simply her reacting to others, but something shared, something that could move between them if given the space to do so. She tilted her head slightly, watching him more intently now, as if she had noticed the same shift. And the faint sound she made this time carried a different tone, less uncertain, more deliberate, almost like an attempt to reach across a gap that neither of them fully understood. Lucas exhaled slowly, grounding himself again, and let his hand rest flat against the metal floor, fingers spread, a simple, visible point of contact that anchored him in the moment. He did not speak, not yet, because words felt too narrow for what was happening, too fixed, and whatever this was required something more fluid, something that could adapt as it unfolded. The station systems chimed softly in the background, signaling the restoration of auxiliary functions, doors unlocking in distant corridors, air circulation stabilizing across multiple decks, life returning to a structure that had been on the verge of shutting down. But here, in this room, the focus remained unchanged, centered entirely on the space between two beings who had chosen, in different ways, not to follow the expected pattern. She shifted again, this time leaning forward just a fraction, closing the distance by inches rather than feet. And the air responded with a faint, almost imperceptible warmth, not physical heat, but something like it. A softening of the invisible boundary that had existed since he entered. Lucas did not move to meet her, did not rush to fill the space. He simply remained where he was, allowing her to set the pace, to define the boundary on her own terms. And in that restraint, there was a kind of respect that needed no translation. The flask tipped slightly in her hand, and after a brief pause she brought it to her lips, taking a small, careful sip, and the moment was so ordinary, so simple, that it carried more weight than anything else that had happened so far. Lucas allowed himself a small breath of relief, barely noticeable, and as she lowered the flask again, her gaze returning to him, there was something new in her expression, something that had not been there before, not fear, not confusion, but the first quiet trace of trust, fragile and undefined, yet unmistakably present. And in that moment, Lucas understood that whatever they had been told about her, whatever label had been written on that door, it had missed something essential, something that could only be seen by someone willing to stay long enough to look. The station had returned to life in measurable ways, air cycling cleanly through the vents, distant systems coming online in orderly sequences, but inside the room the shift was quieter, more deliberate, as if whatever balance had formed here was not part of the station at all, but something separate, something that did not follow the same rules as circuits and power grids. Lucas remained seated, posture unchanged, but his awareness sharpened, not because of danger, but because of the subtle patterns beginning to repeat, the way her movements now carried less hesitation, the way her breathing, if it could be called that, had found a slower rhythm that matched the steady hum around them. She still held the flask, but no longer like an unfamiliar object. Her grip relaxed, fingers resting against its surface as if it were simply something she had chosen to keep, and when her gaze returned to him, it did not search, it settled. Like she had reached a conclusion, she was still learning how to trust. Another faint ripple moved through the air then, more distinct this time, brushing across his skin with a clarity that made him straighten slightly, not alarmed, but aware, and this time the sensation lingered longer, not a passing echo but something sustained, something reaching outward with intent. Lucas inhaled slowly, grounding himself the way he had learned in long hours of working in unstable environments, focusing on the physical. The contact of his hand against the metal floor, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the weight of his own presence in the room. And as he did, the ripple shifted, adjusting, like it was responding not just to him being there, but to how he chose to be there. Her head tilted again, a fraction more pronounced than before, and there was a faint narrowing of her eyes that suggested concentration, effort, as if she were trying to understand a signal that did not follow the patterns she was built to recognize. The word built came to him uninvited, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility, something. In the structure of this place, the abandoned equipment, the incomplete restraints, the way everything about her seemed both organic and engineered, and he wondered, briefly, not what she had done, but what had been done to her. The thought did not linger, because the moment demanded presence more than speculation, and speculation had a way of introducing doubt, and doubt had a way of turning into fear, and fear was the one thing that consistently shifted the air in the wrong direction. She leaned forward again, closing the distance by another inch or two, and this time when the ripple passed between them it carried something clearer, not just tension, not just awareness, but a faint, almost tangible impression of something else, something like hesitation layered with something softer, something that did not feel like a threat at all. Lucas let his shoulders relax further, consciously releasing any residual tension, and lowered his gaze just slightly, not breaking eye contact entirely but softening it, reducing the intensity in a way that felt instinctive. The same way one might approach a situation where too much focus could be misread. The effect was immediate in its own quiet way, the ripple easing, the air settling again into that fragile equilibrium they had begun to recognize. A soft chime echoed faintly from the corridor beyond the sealed door, voices returning to the comm network in distant fragments, normalcy reasserting itself just outside this space. But here, the moment held, uninterrupted. She made another sound then, clearer than before, still not a word Lucas could understand, but structured, shaped, as if it carried meaning she expected him to receive. And when he did not respond with confusion or alarm, only with steady presence, the tension in her posture eased further, shoulders lowering, the line of her body less guarded. He shifted one hand slightly, sliding it across the metal floor a few inches closer to the space between them, slow enough that the movement could not be mistaken for anything sudden, and left it there, open, palm down, a simple, visible gesture that carried no demand, no expectation, only availability. Her gaze followed the motion, then returned to his face, and for a brief second the ripple intensified again, not sharply, but enough that he felt it more clearly than before, a layered sensation that held something unfamiliar, something like curiosity amplified through a system not designed to filter it gently. Lucas held steady, breathing even, resisting the instinct to interpret too quickly, and after a moment the ripple softened once more, settling into something that felt almost calm. She did not move to close the remaining distance, did not reach for his hand, but she did not retreat either, and in that stillness there was a quiet agreement forming, unspoken but understood, that this space, this fragile connection, could exist without being forced into something it was not ready to become. And as the steady hum of the station continued around them, Lucas realized that whatever she was sensing, whatever she was learning from him, it was not just that he was not afraid, it was that he was choosing not to be, and that choice, more than anything else, was what allowed the room to remain whole. The first sign that something had changed beyond the room came not from her, but from the door, a low mechanical click followed by a shift in pressure as external systems finally regained full authority, and Lucas felt it instantly, the difference between isolation and connection returning all at once, like the station had remembered how to breathe without struggling. A voice crackled faintly through his wrist, calm, distorted but clear enough to carry urgency, calling out for status updates, for confirmation that the relay had been restored, that the containment sector was stable, and Lucas did not answer immediately, not because he could not, but because the moment unfolding in front of him required more attention than any report he could give. She reacted to the sound before he did, her body tensing just slightly, the faint tremor returning along her arms as the ripple in the air sharpened, no longer soft and exploratory, but edged with something closer to alarm, not directed at him, but at the intrusion itself, the sudden reminder of everything beyond this room. Lucas lifted his wrist slowly, movements controlled, and tapped the comm once to silence it, not disconnecting, just muting the noise, and as the sound cut off, the air shifted again, the tension easing by a measurable degree, like a wave receding before it could crest. He lowered his hand back to the floor, re-establishing that simple point of contact, and met her gaze, steady, unchanged, offering the same consistency he had since the beginning. She watched him closely, more intensely now, as if the interruption had forced her to reassess, to test whether his presence would change under pressure, whether he would become like the others once the outside world reached in. Another ripple passed between them, stronger. This time, carrying layers of sensation that pressed lightly against his senses, not overwhelming, but undeniable, and within it he felt something clearer than before, not just tension, not just curiosity, but something like expectation, fragile and uncertain, as if she were waiting for a response she could not fully define. Lucas exhaled slowly, grounding himself again, and leaned forward just a fraction, reducing the distance by inches, not enough to invade, just enough to answer that unspoken question with action instead of words. The effect was immediate, the sharp edge in the air softening, the ripples smoothing into something more even, more controlled, and her posture followed, shoulders lowering slightly, the tremor diminishing as the connection stabilized once more. Outside, the muffled sound of footsteps approached, distant but growing. The rhythm of boots against metal carrying through the corridor beyond the sealed door, organized, purposeful, and Lucas knew without needing to check that a response team had been dispatched, drawn by the system alerts and the silence from his comm. He did not turn toward the sound, did not acknowledge it outwardly, because acknowledging it would shift his focus, and focus mattered here in ways he was only beginning to understand. She heard it too, her head turning just slightly toward the door before snapping back to him. The ripple spiking again, sharper now, tinged with something unmistakable, not aggression, not exactly, but a defensive reaction triggered by the anticipation of what those approaching footsteps represented. Lucas felt it wash over him, that rising tension, and for the first time he understood it not as something to resist, but something to counterbalance, and he let his own breathing slow even further, deliberately calming his body, his posture, his presence, pushing back against the rising wave not with force, but with steadiness. He placed his other hand on the floor, both palms now grounded. Shoulders relaxed, gaze steady, and held that state with intention, offering a constant in the face of incoming disruption. The ripple met that steadiness and hesitated, fluctuating for a moment as if caught between two opposing signals. And then, gradually, it began to level out, not disappearing, but stabilizing, held in place by something she was still learning how to control and something he was choosing to provide. The footsteps outside grew louder, stopping just beyond the door, voices now audible in low, controlled tones, coordinating, preparing, and Lucas knew that whatever happened next would not be quiet, would not be simple. But he also knew that the space they had created here could not be broken without consequence. Not for the station, not for her. He did not look away from her as the door mechanisms engaged, as the first locks began to cycle open, because in that final moment before the outside world entered, the only thing that mattered was the choice he had already made, to remain, to stay exactly where he was, even when everything else was about to change. The door did not burst open. It unfolded, each lock disengaging in sequence with a controlled precision that spoke of training and protocol. And as the final seal released, a line of bright corridor light cut across the floor, slicing through the softer tones of the room and casting long shadows that stretched toward Lucas and the figure beside him. The first of the responders stepped in with careful footing, not rushed, not reckless. Their presence defined more by caution than aggression. Though the tension they carried was unmistakable, a tightness in posture, in breath, in the way their eyes fixed immediately on the center of the room. Lucas did not turn toward them, not fully. He only shifted his gaze just enough to acknowledge their arrival, without breaking the connection he had maintained, and that choice mattered. He could feel it in the way the air responded, the ripple around him tightening for a fraction of a second before meeting the steadiness he continued to hold. Voices followed, low and controlled, instructions layered over each other in clipped phrases, requesting status, identifying positions, asking if the subject was responsive, if the area was secure, and Lucas let the words pass through the space without attaching to them, because attaching would mean shifting his focus outward, and outward was where the tension lived. She reacted immediately to their presence, her posture drawing inward again, shoulders tightening, the tremor returning stronger now, not violent, but pronounced, and the ripple that spread from her carried a sharper edge, not directed, but reactive, like a system pushed too quickly beyond its current limit. Lucas felt it press against him, not physically, but in that same layered way he had begun to recognize, an echo of something deeper than instinct, something shaped by repetition and expectation, and he understood then, with a clarity that settled into his chest, that what they called a threat was not an intent. It was a response, a feedback loop that had never been given a stable input. One of the responders took a step forward, cautious but firm, and the ripple spiked, sharper this time, the air tightening as if the room itself was bracing. And Lucas moved without hesitation, not toward the responders, but slightly closer to her, closing the space by another inch, enough to interrupt the pattern before it could escalate. He raised one hand slowly, palm outward, not as a command, but as a signal, and spoke for the first time with intent that carried beyond her, his voice calm but clear, asking them to stop where they were, to hold position, not because he outranked them, but because he understood something they did not yet see. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, the kind that only happened when expectation met contradiction, and in that pause the ripple hesitated again, caught between the incoming tension and the steadiness Lucas maintained. He did not look back to see if they would comply. He kept his attention forward, on her, because she was the center of the equation, not them. And after a second that stretched longer than it should have, the footsteps stopped, the line held, and the air shifted again, easing by degrees as the immediate pressure lessened. Lucas lowered his hand slowly, returning it to the floor, re-establishing that grounded point, and leaned forward just slightly, enough to reaffirm his position without crowding her space. Her gaze locked onto him with an intensity that had changed. Once more, no longer searching, no longer uncertain, but focused in a way that suggested understanding was forming, not complete, not stable yet, but present. The ripple moved again, softer this time, less chaotic, and within it Lucas felt something clearer than before, not fear, not confusion, but a fragile alignment, as if she was beginning to separate him from the others, to recognize the difference not just in behavior, but in intent. Behind him, the responders remained still, their tension not gone but contained, held in check by the unexpected dynamic unfolding in front of them. And the room, for all its history, for all the warnings written on its door, did not fracture under the weight of their arrival. Instead, it held, balanced on something far simpler and far more difficult to maintain. A single human choosing to remain steady when everything around him expected him to step back. And in that choice, the definition of what she was began, quietly, to change. For a moment, nothing moved. Not the responders at the door, not Lucas, not even the air that had spent so long shifting between tension and calm. And in that stillness, something subtle settled into place. Something that did not belong to systems or protocols, but to the space between two beings who had, against every expectation, chosen not to follow the pattern. Lucas remained exactly where he was, both hands resting against the metal floor, posture open, steady, unchanged, and the consistency of that choice carried more weight now than any words he could have spoken. She watched him with that same focused intensity, but it had softened, not losing clarity, only losing its edge, as if whatever mechanism within her had once responded only to extremes was beginning to recognize something in between. The ripple moved again, slow and even, no longer searching, no longer reacting sharply, but flowing outward with a kind of quiet stability that had not existed before. And when it reached Lucas, it did not press against him. It aligned with him, matching the rhythm of his breath, the calm he had chosen to hold since the beginning. Behind him, the responders shifted slightly, not advancing, not retreating. Their presence still defined by caution but no longer escalating, held in place by something they did not fully understand but instinctively recognized as fragile. One of them lowered their stance just a fraction, tension easing in small, careful increments, mirroring the change happening at the center of the room without realizing it. Lucas did not look back, but he felt it, the way the pressure from behind had lessened, the way the room as a whole was no longer being pulled in opposing directions. She moved then, not away, not defensive, but forward, just enough to close the final inches between them. And for the first time since he had entered, the distance that had defined every interaction dissolved into something else, something shared. Her hand, still holding the flask, lowered slowly to the floor between them, and then, with a motion that carried both hesitation and intent, her other hand shifted closer to his, not touching, not yet, but resting within that same small space he had offered from the beginning. The ripple followed, softer than ever before, carrying not tension, not confusion, but something clearer, something that did not need translation to be understood. Lucas remained still, not reaching forward, not pulling away, allowing the moment to exist exactly as it was, unforced, and in that restraint there was a kind of respect that shaped the air itself. Seconds passed, or maybe longer, time losing its usual structure in a room that had already stepped outside of it. And then her fingers moved again, closing the final distance by the smallest measure, brushing lightly against the back of his hand. The contact so minimal it could have been accidental, but it was not. The ripple that followed did not spike, did not fracture the space. It settled, spreading outward in a smooth, even wave that carried a sense of balance the room had never held before. Lucas exhaled slowly, not in relief, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement, and did not move his hand, did not break the contact, because breaking it would mean returning to something they had already left behind. Behind him, no one spoke, no one interrupted. The entire room held in a quiet that was no longer tense, no longer waiting for something to go wrong, but simply present. The lights above remained steady, casting a clean, even glow across the metal surfaces, across the cables that no longer defined her, across the door where the word written there had already begun to lose its meaning. Lucas looked at her, really looked, not at what she had been called, not at what others expected her to be, but at what was in front of him now, and for the first time, there was no distance left to bridge. The station outside would continue, reports would be filed, explanations would be demanded, but none of that existed in this moment. Because in this moment, the only thing that mattered was that something had changed, not through force, not through control, but through a choice so small it could have been overlooked. He had stayed, and she had answered, and in the quiet that followed, the idea of a monster no longer had anywhere to stand, because it had been replaced by something far simpler, something the room itself seemed to understand now, that sometimes the difference between fear and understanding was not power, not knowledge, but the willingness to sit beside what everyone else had already decided to leave behind.